Hey there, my name is AJ Garcia. I work in the communications department for the Tahoma School District. In this February special election, the voters within our district boundary will vote on 2 levy propositions. And as part of our commitment to ensure that you have all the information you need before you cast your ballot, I'm here to give some facts and information about what's on the ballot. So a couple things I want to accomplish in our short time together. Number one, I want you to have a full understanding of what school district levies are, why Tahoma has them, what they pay for, and then what would be the consequence if we lost that levy funding moving forward. And then second, I want to give you an opportunity to be able to share your questions directly with the district. So we'll have a link and a QR code at the end where you can submit those questions, and then we are more than happy to connect back with you and answer them. So first things first, what is on the ballot? Well, if you've already gotten your ballot, you've seen this. If you haven't yet, there are 2 propositions that you'll see. Proposition 1 is the replacement of our Educational Programs and Operations levy. We oftentimes call that our EP&O levy. And Proposition 2 is a replacement of our Technology Capital Projects levy. We oftentimes call that the TEC levy. Something to know about Proposition 1, almost every public school district in Washington state has one of these levies or has proposed them to their community but may have not gotten them passed. Some districts might call it an education levy, an operations levy, an enrichment levy. At Tahoma, we call it our EP&O levy. So a little history, back in 2020, our community voted to approve 2 levies by the same exact names. At the time, our community voted to approve them for a 4-year collection. That means the district, because they were passed in 2020, collected those funds in 2021, 22, 23, and now here we are in 2024, which is our last collection year, which is why we're in that position where our school board is again going to our local community, asking them whether they want to continue to provide that funding moving forward. So I mentioned that they were passed for a 4-year cycle. If you see up toward the top of the slide, it says 2-year replacement. So why is our board seeking 2-year levies versus 4-year levies? Well, there's a really long answer and then there's a simpler answer. That shorter answer is, as we've looked at the property values, the assessed value within our district boundary, particularly post-COVID, we've seen a lot of unusual trends. A couple years ago, property values increased by about 18%, which is one of the highest, if not the highest we've ever seen. Then last year they increased by 30%, which we've never seen before. And now this year, if you've already taken a look at your tax bill, you may have noticed a dip in your assessed value, which is about 10 to 11% for the average property owner within our boundary. So as our school board looked at those assessed values, as they look further and further down the line, 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now, it's really difficult to predict what are those property values going to look like, especially in our current climate. So our board said, let's seek 2-year levies. We'll ask our community to vote on a 2-year commitment versus a 4 right now, where we can be more confident in what those property values are going to do for the next couple of years. And then in the meantime, we'll evaluate what is that need going to be beyond 2026. So, mentioned ballots were mailed to voters on Wednesday, January 24th. Please check your mail if you haven't already to find your ballot. And election date is February 13th, so right around the corner. What are levies? Why do we have them? Well, in Washington state, we have a funding model that we often use the term basic education when talking about it. So, our state has a requirement to fund basic education. When we look at what is provided through the state's funding model versus what is our community's expectation for the experience of a student in the Tahoma School District, what we find is that many of the programs, staff, services, and technology that are funded by the state do not meet that expectation. And so local levies are able to close that funding gap for our district and again, all districts in Washington state. I put this sentence at the bottom that says a loss of levy funds would mean significant reductions in staff, programs, and services for students. I like to preface that by saying that that's not meant to be threatening, it's not meant to be scary. It's just a reality of when we look at what the state provides versus the actual cost to currently run our schools to the level that we do. If you were to remove levy funding from that equation, it would require those significant cuts. So you saw the term replacement on each of those levy propositions. What does replacement levy mean? Well, when we talk about replacement levies in the Tahoma School District, we view them really as a means to maintain funding for the things that we currently have in our schools. We oftentimes get asked, are you adding a bunch of stuff? Are you going out for the shiny new objects? Particularly for the financial position our district is currently in, our goal with these levies is not to be able to add a bunch of stuff, but to be able to maintain what we currently have in our schools. So that's why you see the term replacement on each of those propositions. Taking a little closer look at what each of these levies pays for in the Tahoma School District, on this slide are some of the things that are either partially or fully funded by the EP&O levy. So first thing, safety and security personnel. In Tahoma, we have 2 school resource officers, or SROs. Those are deputies who are contracted with our district through the King County Sheriff's Office. We also have school safety officers at each of our middle schools and our high school. We have building managers who are really in charge of overseeing the safety of our elementary schools, and then we also have a head of district security as well. All in all, we've got about 9 people who are focused on the safety of our students, our staff, and our schools every single day. Of those 9 staff that I just mentioned, the state funds about 1.7 of the salaries for those staff, meaning that gap of 7.3 staff is primarily filled in through this EP&O levy. Mental health support, this is where the formula already starts to get a little bit tricky. We do get funded for many of our counselors and many of our paraeducators. Again, I point to that term basic education. What does the state provide? What is our community's expectation for Tahoma students? What we see is that we don't get fully funded for our counselors and our paraeducators. Our SEL paras are our social emotional learning paraeducators. Many of those are partially funded through our levy. And then other things within our mental health supports too. We have a district wellness coordinator. We have a community resource coordinator who is partially funded through the city of Maple Valley and partially funded by the district. Those 2 members of our staff, as well as many of their community wellness programming, where we'll bring in experts to meet with the community and talk about things like the dangers of fentanyl, the dangers of social media, to do suicide prevention awareness. Many of those programs are also paid for through the EP&O levy because they fall outside of that basic education funding model. Special education for the Tahoma School District, when we're talking about a pure dollars standpoint, special education is where we currently see the widest gap. Most of our funding does come from the state. We do get some funding from the federal government. When you combine our state and federal resources, what we saw last school year was still a gap of about $6.3 million. So a little over $6 million comes from this EP&O levy currently to be able to provide IEP 504 services to our students who need those additional supports. And then sports clubs and activities. So again, I point back to that term basic education. According to the funding model, sports clubs activities fall outside of basic education, so our district does not receive any funding for those things. Starting at the elementary level with programs like 0 Hour, and then of course as you go up to the middle and high school levels, just about any clubs activities that you can think of, drama, robotics, We the People, and then all of our athletics teams as well. Much of their travel gets funded through this EP&O levy. Other things that get funded by the EP&O levy, so first at the top of the list here is people. Bus drivers, nutrition services, counselors, front office teams, just about everybody at our central office. All of those support positions are either partially or fully funded through this levy. Academic programming, so starting at the elementary level, if you have students in our elementary schools or have had students in our elementary schools recently, you know that we have art, music, a class that's somewhat specific to Tahoma called Future Ready. We have STEM and we have physical education. We have all 5 of those classes at every one of our elementary schools. When we look at the state funding model again, the state funds for physical education and then about 1/2 of 1 additional staff member for elementary specialist time. So most of the programming for those other 4 specialist classes gets funded through our levy. Other things at the elementary level are learning assistance programs for math and reading. We oftentimes call those MAP and RAP. Our high cap program for our high achieving students, and then field trips. Many of our field trips, including the annual trip that our elementary students take to Camp Casey, is partially funded through this levy as well. As we go up through the system to our secondary levels, our advanced placement, our AP courses, other dual credit opportunities, the 8-period day at Tahoma High School, Tahoma runs more periods and therefore more credit opportunities for our high school students than most of our neighboring districts. The state does not pay for an 8-period day, so when we think of those additional credit opportunities, those extra hours that we're providing for our students, much of that gets funded through this levy as well. As far as our teachers go, a portion of every single teacher's salary in our system is funded by the EP&O levy. Many of our teachers are fully funded through that EP&O levy. How does that work? Well, when we look again at the funding model from the state, what we see is that we get funded for our teachers essentially from the time that our students arrive to when our students leave at the end of the day. It's the time that students are sitting in a classroom. So planning periods for teachers, before school time, after school time, professional development, training opportunities, not just for teachers, but training for all of our staff falls outside of basic education funding. So much of that comes from the EP&O levy as well. And then the last one on this list is multilingual learner support. The number of students in the Tahoma School District whose first language is not English and who are developing their English language skills and receive multilingual services has grown exponentially over recent years. In the last 5 years, the number of students receiving MLL support has increased by about 200 kids. So we're seeing more and more languages spoken in our community, in our district. Our schools are getting more diverse, and it's a really wonderful thing. And we want to make sure that we're fully supporting all of our students in their language development. And so part of those MLL services also get funded through our EP&O levy. Moving over to the technology levy side of things. So the tech levy, no surprise, funds a lot of technology. Laptops, computers, digital curriculum, other instructional tools, accessibility tools. So I oftentimes think of our students who don't speak, or I also think of our multilingual learners here. Our students who are using devices like tablets and iPads to communicate their needs, communicate with peers and their teachers. Those devices get funded through this levy as well. Security. So some things that in my mind make sense when we talk about tech and security are ransomware, firewalls, network security, those student and family data privacy needs that we have, but then also some of our physical security needs like our badges, our key card access, our cameras and our radios also get funded through the tech levy. And then even though it's tech, we also see people whose salaries and wages are supported through this levy as well. So we have a technology department. Many of those staff get funded through this levy. We also have instructional coaches who one of their primary roles is really to support our teachers in effectively using technology in the classroom so that students are leveraging tech where it really makes sense. Our instructional coaches also get partially funded through this tech levy. That was all the stuff. Now we're going to transition to the financial side of things. So first things here, we're looking at this pie chart. What this is the pie that makes up our general fund revenue, our operating budget, what goes into that main bank account. For Tahoma, about 80% of the revenue that goes into our general fund comes from the state. A little sliver comes from the feds. For us, it's about 3%. And then there's that 17% of local dollars. Almost all of that 17% is specifically the EP&O levy. I put this in context to say that about 85% of what gets spent out of that pie, our annual expenses, goes towards people. It's salaries, wages, and benefits. So it kind of helps paint that picture of what would happen if we lost that 17% of local funding. It would require those significant cuts to be able to simply keep our doors open. This here is looking at that same pie, but how it's changed over time. So for me, I think this helps tell a story of, one, how is the district doing financially? What's our current financial position? Two, how did we get to where we're at? And then of course, number three, how does this story inform what we're doing moving forward when it comes to our local levies? So to tell this story, I go all the way back to the far left end there, back to 2013. In 2013, our community voted to approve a construction bond It's the construction bond that built the new Tahoma High School that I'm currently sitting in. It built the new Lake Wilderness Elementary School. It also allowed us to make warm, safe, dry improvements at every one of our campuses in the district. At that time when the community approved the bond, our school board looked at our financial position and knew that we were going to be opening new buildings, adding new staff, and so to ensure that we'd be able to afford it when we opened up those new schools, our board at the time made a decision to start to save a little bit of money, put a little bit away so that when we did open our new schools up, we weren't in a dangerous position where we weren't going to be able to afford those changes to our district. So that's where you see the fund balance start to build up over those first few years. We opened our new schools in 2017. Around that same time, 2017-18, is when a really important thing also happened at the state level called the McCleary decision. If you're not familiar with the McCleary decision or just need a little refresher on it, the McCleary decision was the result of a lawsuit in which a group of folks sued Washington State and claimed that the state was not meeting its requirement to fully fund education. Those folks won, the state lost, and so one of the primary outcomes of the McCleary decision was that the amount of funding that the state was providing to schools went up, but the amount that school districts could collect from their community and local levies was reduced. It sort of flipped upside down the funding model for schools in Washington State. One of the other outcomes of that was it created a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen in the future for state funding. First, from members of communities who were then voting on local levies, the question came up of, wait a minute, I thought the state was now fully funding education in the state. Why are we continuing to vote on local levies? And as we just saw in those previous slides, we still see where those gaps exist, but it created a lot of confusion, particularly for folks who were then voting on local levies. From a district perspective, it created that uncertainty about what was our financial position going to be moving forward. And so again, we were in a place where our school board said, let's be cautious about our spending. Let's not spend down what's in our fund balance so that we can be prepared for whatever comes in the future. That brings us to 2019-20, which is when the district's fund balance was at its peak at $37.3 million. So after saving for about 7 years, we were now in a position where our school board said, we have $37.3 million in the bank, and we actually feel like that's too much to have. It's more than we want to have in our general fund. And so through lots of tough conversations, looking at our own financial position, looking at districts around us, having conversations with other financial departments, our board identified a target for our fund balance of 10 to 12% of our annual expenses. Why 10 to 12%? Well, for the Tahoma School District, 10 to 12%, or what right now is about $16.9 million that you see there in 2023-24. For our district, that $17 million is about 1 month of expenses. So $17 million sure does sound like a lot of money. From our district's operating budget perspective, that would keep our doors open for about a month if there were some scenario where we did not receive any revenue. So that's what the board set as the target. Backing back up a little bit again, we're in 2019-20, there was $37.3 million in the bank. The board knew they wanted to get closer to that 10 to 12% target. Well, how are we going to get there? At the time, the board looked at that $37.3 million and said, we're in a position right now where we can propose levies to our community that go out for less than the maximum collection rate. So basically saying we won't ask our community to make as big of a financial commitment because our district's in a position where we can afford to use what's in that fund balance. And so intentionally, over that next collection cycle, the levy collection cycle that we're currently in, over that time, we will intentionally spend more money than we're receiving, and we'll spend down that fund balance until we reach that target amount. So at first glance, it may look like the district is quickly losing money. Where we're going to end at in 23-24 is right around that 10 to 12% target. This has been part of the plan that was put in place about 4 years ago. And so right now we're in a position where we're actually on target. we're right at that number that our board asked for back in 2019-20 before the current levies were passed in February of 2020. So now moving forward, we were in a position in 2019-20 where there was that $37.3 million in the general fund. We've hit our target now for 23-24. Now the goal is to figure out how do we keep our fund balance sustainable over time. So what we're looking at on the far right there, you see that fund balance start to flatten out. We oftentimes call that our glide path. How are we going to, moving forward, match our revenue to our expenditures and stay more consistent and more balanced moving forward? Well, when it comes to our levies, remember in 2019-20, we were in that position where our school board proposed those smaller levy rates because they were going to rely on that larger fund balance. Now we're in a position where financially we're still doing okay. We're where we want to be at our target, but we know that if we continue to move at that same pace without either reducing expenditures, which for us means making those significant cuts that we talked about, or increasing revenue, then we'll get in a position where it's not sustainable moving forward. So for our school board, they've taken that approach of discussing how can we increase revenue. And so when it comes to our EP&O levy rate, rather than the $2 per $1,000 of assessed valuation rate that our community passed in 2020, the board for these renewals is now proposing an EP&O levy rate of $2.50 per thousand of assessed value. So that's the strategy that our board is proposing to be able to flatten our revenue and our expenditures over time to keep our district sustainable without making significant cuts. The tech levy side is a little bit different story than the EP&O levy. Our tech levy funds sit in our capital budget, which is different from the general fund. And so the tech levy rate is essentially able to stay the same from the current levies to the now proposed levy rates of about 40 cents per $1,000 of assessed value. With our tech levy spending plan, we're looking to, again, maintain funding for a lot of the things that we have. So continuing to pay for the salaries and wages of staff who are funded through the tech levy, and also continuing our standard refresh cycles for things like computers and curriculum. So the EP&O levy is $2.50 per thousand. The tech levy stays just about the same at 40 cents per thousand. This here is each of those levies broken down annually. The reason that I show this slide is because we oftentimes get asked, if my property value goes up, up, and up, are my local school taxes going to follow suit? The answer is no. Why is that? Well, when you, our community, vote on our levies this February, what you're voting on is not actually those tax rates. It's not the $2.50, it's not the 40 cents. What you're voting on is those total levy amounts for each year and then that bottom line. That means that our district, the Tahoma School District, will never exceed the collection amount for each of those years. So even if property values go way up and up in ways that we're not anticipating, we are capped at those total collection amounts. So what that means from a homeowner's perspective is if your property value does go way, way up, the dollar amount that you're paying to these taxes is going to roughly stay the same. What that would look like on your tax bill is that tax rate would start to decrease. So instead of $2.50, maybe $2.45, $2.40, whatever that rate is to match up to that number, but we'll never collect beyond that amount. So if your property value goes up, you don't see those taxes go up in line with that property value. Now we're zooming in on an individual property within our district boundary. When we look at 2023, the year that we just wrapped up, our data tells us that the average property value, the average assessed value as assigned by the King County Assessor's Office within our Tahoma School District boundary was $750,000. That was the average property in our boundary. Now as we move to 2024, I mentioned those strange trends in assessed value over the recent years. Now we see that that same property that King County assessed at $750,000 last year is now being assessed at $668,000. So when we talk about the average property within the Tahoma School District boundary, we use $668,000 as our number. As we look ahead to 2025-26, our projections show that that same property next year will be valued at $702,000, and then in 2026 at $739,000. Moving over to the next column, that projected tax rate. What makes up that $3.81 or $381 per thousand of assessed value? Well, there's three things that make up that number. It's the current EP&O levy, it's the current tech levy, and it's the continued payment of that 2013 bond that built the high school, Lake Wilderness, and made upgrades at all of our campuses. When you take those three taxes combined, it comes out this year for that property owner at a tax rate of $3.81 per thousand. Plug that into the formula, what you see is that for the average property owner in our boundary, this year, $2,545 of their property taxes will go directly to the Tahoma School District for those three distributions, the two levies and the bond. If we assume for a moment that the levies pass at the proposed rate, and we look at that increased value in 2025, we would see that rate go to $4.28 per thousand. And so that average property owner who currently is valued at $668,000, next year they will pay $3,005 in their local school district taxes, which is a $460 increase. In year two, which would be the last year of the proposed levy collection, that property owner would see another increase of about $140. So, long way to say the average property owner with the proposed levies would see an increase of about $460 annually in year one, and then a year-over-year increase of about $140 in year two. There's a lot of numbers on this slide, and I'm going to try and break it down and simplify it. So, looking at the left half of your screen, what you see there is every single King County school district ranked by revenue per pupil, revenue per student. When we look at that revenue per student, you see for Tahoma it's $17,057. Well, what makes up that $17,057? It's that whole pie that I showed earlier with the state, the federal, and the local dollars, those EP&O levy dollars combined. And so Tahoma sits third from the bottom, 18 of 20, in what we receive in revenue per student. Why does Tahoma sit near the bottom of that list? Well, there's two reasons. One of the reasons is around our free and reduced price meals population. So some of our neighboring districts have a higher percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced price meals. One of the financial outcomes for that is oftentimes more federal funding for those districts, whereas Tahoma doesn't receive as much federal funding as some of our neighbors. The second reason that Tahoma receives less revenue per student than many of our neighbors is a little bit tougher to explain. It centers around our assessed value. So we looked at that average home that's currently worth $668,000 according to the King County Assessor's Office. If we looked at that number for every single residential and commercial property within the Tahoma School District boundary and added up all those assessed values, it would come out somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 billion. When we look at that assessed value, that $11 billion, and divide it by the number of students that we have, or our assessed value per student, what we see is that Tahoma's assessed value per student is lower than many of our neighboring districts. Many of our neighbors have much larger assessed values per student, mainly because of commercial tax bases is the number one reason that we see. So districts that have very large properties, very large commercial properties, large corporations within their boundary increase that assessed value per student. We oftentimes say Tahoma is a bedroom community. It means that a large majority of our tax base in our community is made up by homeowners, whereas in other communities, there are commercial properties that are able to take on more of that tax base. What does that mean from a levies perspective? It means that a district that has a much higher assessed value per student is able to run a levy tax rate that's lower than that of Tahoma, but collect the same or more in revenue per student. So whereas in Tahoma, it's mainly our homeowners who are taking on the cost of our local levies, some districts are able to rely on more of that commercial tax base. So Tahoma, again, sits near that bottom tier in terms of what we collect in revenue per student. What we're seeing here is the 2022-23 fiscal year. That's not a unique year for Tahoma. The prior year, Tahoma was number 20 out of 20. And you can look back over time, Tahoma typically sits in that bottom third or so in what we collect in revenue per student. And then briefly on the other side of the house, the expenditure side. So when you don't have as many resources, you obviously can't spend as much. So again, Tahoma typically sits in that bottom third in expenditures per student, and we can look at that year over year and see that Tahoma typically sits in that area compared to many of our neighboring districts. So those are why we have levies, what they pay for, and again, what would be the result of lost levy funds. Second thing, as I said, we want to be able to gather your questions, be able to follow up with you for more information. So you are always welcome to reach out to me directly. I am the Tahoma School District's jurisdiction administrator for our levy propositions. That means that I'm your main contact. If you do have questions about our local levies, you're welcome to reach out directly to me. My email is ajgarcia@tahomasd.us. What we also have here is a QR code. If you're watching this video on a laptop or a desktop, you can grab your phone and scan the QR code. Otherwise, you can go to that bit.ly there. It's bit.ly/TSD levies form. Both of those options will take you to a Google form where you're able to submit questions that way. We also have a web page dedicated to facts and information about the 2024 replacement levies. That's tahomasd.us/levies. So feel free to go online, find more information about these levies. Much of the information that I just talked about is listed there as well. So thank you very much for your continued support of the Tahoma School District. We appreciate you taking the time to sit through a lengthy video to learn more about what's on the ballot, and thank you for being engaged in the education of our students in Tahoma.